The morning sun painted golden streaks across the Memphis sky as Michelle pulled into the Fresh Value grocery store parking lot. It was just past 8, her favorite time to shop when the store wasn't too crowded and the produce was freshly stocked. She adjusted her bright yellow cardigan, a gift from her fourth-grade students, and grabbed her recycled shopping bags from the passenger seat. Life had settled into a comfortable routine for the 35-year-old teacher. Sundays were split between grocery shopping, meal prep, and spending quality time with her mother, who was recovering from hip surgery. The hospital bills had been piling up, but Michelle kept her spirits high, finding joy in the small moments that made life special. As she pushed her cart through the automatic doors, the familiar scent of fresh bread from the bakery section filled the air. The elderly Mr. Thompson, who had been greeting customers at this store for over 2 decades, gave her his usual warm smile. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he called out, his voice carrying the cheerful tone that had become a staple of her weekly shopping trips. Michelle smiled back, her mind already running through her carefully planned shopping list. As a teacher's salary didn't stretch as far as it used to, she had become an expert at finding the best deals and planning her meals down to the last ingredient. Her students often joked about how she could turn any math problem into a lesson about grocery budgeting. Making her way to the produce section, she couldn't help but think about tomorrow's class. She had planned a special lesson about community service, wanting to inspire her students to look beyond their own needs and see how they could help others. Her grandmother had always told her that kindness was like planting seeds. You might not see the results right away, but eventually, something beautiful would grow. The store was quiet at this hour, with just a few early birds like herself carefully selecting their fruits and vegetables. The soft hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels created a peaceful backdrop. Michelle checked the firmness of an avocado, remembering how her mother had taught her to pick the perfect ones for her famous guacamole. As she moved between the colorful displays of fresh produce, her mind wandered to the upcoming school week. Her fourth graders were preparing for their first big science project, and she had promised to bring in some vegetables to demonstrate photosynthesis. She picked up some celery stalks, imagining the excited faces of her students as they would watch the colored water travel up the stems. Near the organic section, she ran into Mrs. Chen, one of her students' grandmothers, who was picking out bok choy. They chatted briefly about her grandson's improving math grades, and Michelle felt that familiar warmth that came from being part of a close-knit community. This was why she loved teaching in the same neighborhood where she lived. These small connections that made everyone feel like family. Looking at her watch, Michelle realized she needed to pick up her pace if she wanted to make it to her mother's house by 11. Sundays were special. They would cook together, share stories, and work on the puzzle they had started last weekend. Even with the challenges of medical bills and recovery, these moments with her mother were precious. She pulled out her neatly written shopping list, organized by store sections to make the trip more efficient. Her colleagues often teased her about her organized nature, but as a teacher and part-time caregiver, she had learned that good planning made everything easier. Today's list was longer than usual. She needed ingredients for the week's meals, supplies for her classroom, and some of her mother's favorite snacks. The morning light streamed through the store's high windows, creating patches of brightness on the polished floor. Michelle adjusted her cart's wobbly wheel, a small challenge she had learned to navigate over the years. She never could have guessed that this ordinary Sunday morning shopping trip was about to become something extraordinary, something that would touch not only her life, but ripple through the entire community in unexpected ways. Little did she know, as she consulted her shopping list one more time, that fate had something special in store for her that day. A chance encounter that would remind everyone in their small corner of Memphis that the simplest acts of kindness could blossom into something beautiful and lasting. The peaceful morning quiet was broken by a sudden clatter. Michelle looked up from the tomatoes she was examining to see several cans rolling across the floor. In the next aisle, an elderly white-haired man stood frozen, his white cane tangled in the fallen display. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out, trying to understand what had happened. People walked past, some glancing his way, but quickly averting their eyes, pretending not to notice his struggle. A young mother hurriedly steered her cart around the scattered cans, while a teenager with headphones simply stepped over them, eyes glued to his phone. The old man's face reddened with embarrassment as he stood there, uncertain which way to turn. Michelle watched as he cautiously moved his cane, trying to locate the fallen items. His movements were careful but confused, and she could see the tension in his shoulders growing with each passing moment. He wore a neat brown sweater vest and pressed khaki pants that spoke of someone who took pride in his appearance, making his current distress even more touching. Without thinking twice, Michelle left her cart by the tomatoes and approached him. "Sir," she called out softly, not wanting to startle him, "would you like some help?" The relief that washed over his face was immediate and heartbreaking. "Oh, thank you, dear," he replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "I was trying to find the canned peaches my wife used to make the most wonderful peach cobbler." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've been trying to learn her recipe, but navigation in these stores isn't what it used to be since my eyes gave out." As Michelle began picking up the scattered cans, she noticed they were all different items: corn, beans, tomato sauce. Evidence of his difficulty in identifying products. "I'm happy to help you find what you need," she offered, placing the cans back on the shelf. "I'm Michelle, and I shop here every Sunday morning." The gentleman introduced himself as Robert, explaining that his regular caregiver had called in sick with the flu. "I probably should have waited," he admitted, "but when you've been independent for 82 years, it's hard to let a little thing like blindness stop you." His attempt at humor couldn't quite mask the frustration in his voice. As they talked, Michelle noticed the worn wedding band on his finger, which he unconsciously twisted as he spoke about his wife's recipes. She learned he had been a music professor at the local university for over 4 decades, teaching violin to countless students. "Music is the one thing that hasn't changed," he said warmly. "I can still hear every note as clearly as ever." A store employee walked by, finally noticing the situation. "Everything okay here?" he asked, more out of obligation than genuine concern. Michelle assured him they were fine, already reaching for the correct cans of peaches from the shelf. She described each item to Robert, placing them in his cart with gentle explanations of where everything was. Other shoppers began to take notice of their interaction. An elderly woman smiled approvingly as she passed by. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, loudly asking why the man had a stick, leading to a hushed explanation about visual impairment. The atmosphere in the aisle shifted from awkward avoidance to quiet appreciation. Robert shared stories about his teaching days as Michelle helped him navigate the store. He spoke about how music could bridge any gap: age, background, ability. "That's why I loved teaching," he explained. "In music, we're all just trying to create something beautiful together." His face lit up as he described conducting student orchestras, his hands moving instinctively as if holding an invisible baton. The morning light streamed through the store windows, catching the silver of Robert's hair as he turned his head toward each sound. Michelle noticed how he kept one hand on his cart, anchoring himself in space. His dignity in the face of challenge touched her deeply, reminding her of her own mother's determination during recovery. As they moved through the store together, what had started as a simple act of kindness was transforming into something more meaningful. Neither of them could have guessed that this chance encounter would soon ripple out to touch their entire community in ways they couldn't imagine, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary moments start with something as simple as picking up a few fallen cans. Michelle watched as Robert's hand brushed against a box of pasta, his fingers trying to read the raised letters on the package. Without hesitation, she reached for her own shopping list and tucked it into her pocket. Her mother's weekly visit could wait a little longer. Right now, someone needed her help more. "Would you like me to help you finish your shopping?" she offered gently. "I know my way around the store pretty well." The smile that spread across Robert's face made her heart warm. It wasn't just relief she saw there, but a touch of dignity restored. "You must have better things to do on a Sunday morning than help an old man fumble through his groceries," Robert said, though hope colored his voice. Michelle could see how much it had cost him to come here alone, to face this challenge that most people took for granted. "Actually," Michelle replied, thinking of her fourth-grade classroom, "this reminds me of a lesson I'm teaching tomorrow about community. What better way to prepare than to live it?" She guided his cart carefully around a display of cereal boxes, describing the path ahead of them. As they moved through the store together, Robert shared more about his life. His wife had passed away 2 years ago, and his son lived 3 hours away in Nashville. "He wants me to move closer," Robert admitted, "but this house, this community, they're all I have left of her." His voice carried no self-pity, just the simple truth of someone facing life's changes with quiet courage. Michelle noticed how his demeanor changed as they walked. His shoulders relaxed, and his grip on the cart loosened. He began asking about her teaching, genuinely interested in her stories about her students. When she mentioned their upcoming Music Appreciation Week, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh, to be able to introduce young minds to classical music again," he sighed wistfully. "I still have all my old teaching materials in Braille. Sometimes I run my fingers over the music sheets just to remember." His words painted a picture of a man who hadn't lost his passion, just his platform to share it. Other shoppers moved around them, some now smiling at their unlikely due. A store employee who had earlier ignored Robert's struggle now approached, asking if they needed help finding anything. Michelle politely declined, already knowing exactly where everything on Robert's list could be found. They talked about music as they shopped, Robert humming bits of classical pieces as he described them. "Music is mathematics, you know," he explained, his professor's voice returning. "Bach's compositions are pure mathematical poetry." Michelle thought about her students struggling with fractions and wondered if there might be a connection worth exploring. When Robert mentioned needing fresh vegetables for soup, Michelle guided him to the produce section. She placed different items in his hands, letting him feel their shapes and textures. "These tomatoes are perfectly ripe," she explained, helping him select the best ones. "And these carrots are crisp and fresh." His fingers moved carefully over each vegetable, his face showing concentration. "My wife would have loved you," he said suddenly. "She always said you could tell a person's character by how they handle the simple things." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Time seemed to flow differently as they worked their way through his list. What could have been a frustrating, perhaps even humiliating experience for Robert had transformed into something almost enjoyable. He shared cooking tips his wife had taught him, and Michelle found herself taking mental notes about his simple but delicious-sounding recipes. As they neared the end of their shopping, Robert seemed to stand taller, move more confidently. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been avoiding coming here alone since Martha passed. Silly, perhaps, but pride can make cowards of us all." He paused, tapping his cane gently against the floor. "Sometimes we just need a little kindness to help us face our fears." Neither of them knew it yet, but their morning of grocery shopping was about to take an unexpected turn at the checkout counter. The simple decision to help someone in need was about to unfold into something much bigger than either of them could imagine. As Michelle and Robert made their way through the store's well-lit aisles, their conversation flowed as naturally as if they'd known each other for years. Robert's gentle voice carried decades of stories, each one offering a glimpse into a life richly lived. His hands, though weathered with age, moved expressively as he spoke about his years of teaching music. "You should have seen the look on their faces," he chuckled, recalling a memory, "when I first introduced my students to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Some of them thought classical music was boring, but by the end of that first movement, they were absolutely captivated." His face glowed with the warmth of remembrance, momentarily erasing the worry lines around his eyes. Michelle pushed their carts side by side, carefully describing each item they passed. That reminds me of my students, she shared. Last week, I brought in my old guitar for music time, and you'd think I'd brought magic into the classroom. One little boy said he'd never seen a real instrument up close before. Robert's face lit up at this. Music has a way of opening doors we didn't even know existed, he said thoughtfully. In 40 years of teaching, I never met a child who couldn't be reached through music in some way. He tapped his cane gently against the floor, creating a soft rhythm as they walked. They paused in the dairy section, where Michelle helped Robert select eggs, carefully checking each carton for cracks. As she described the different yogurt options available, Robert shared stories about his late wife's famous breakfast gatherings. She'd invite all the new faculty members over, he remembered fondly. Said nobody should start teaching on an empty stomach. A young store employee restocking nearby shelves couldn't help but listen to their conversation. He smiled as Robert demonstrated the proper way to hold a violin, using his cane as a makeshift bow. Michelle noticed how the boy stopped his work, clearly drawn in by Robert's passionate description of teaching proper posture and finger placement. The violin isn't just an instrument, Robert explained, his voice taking on the patient tone of an experienced teacher. It's a voice that speaks directly to the heart. When my sight began to fail, I thought I'd lose music too. But you know what? I hear it more clearly now than ever before. As they moved through the frozen food section, Michelle described the changes in the store since Robert's last visit. New brands, different arrangements, special offers, small details that meant everything to someone who couldn't see them. Robert listened intently, building a mental map with each piece of information. "You have a gift for description," he commented warmly. "You must be a wonderful teacher." Michelle felt her heart swell at the compliment, remembering how her grandmother had always stressed the importance of being thorough and helping others. "It's all in the details," she'd say. "That's where the real caring shows." They shared stories about their families as they completed the shopping. Robert spoke about his son in Nashville, a successful businessman who called twice a day to check on him. "He means well," Robert sighed, "but sometimes independence means more than safety." Michelle thought about her own mother's struggle to maintain dignity during her recovery and nodded understanding. A few regular Sunday shoppers who knew Michelle from her weekly visits watched their interaction with interest. The usual hurried atmosphere of grocery shopping had transformed into something more meaningful in their corner of the store. Even the occasional announcement over the store's speaker system seemed less intrusive, as if respecting the genuine human connection unfolding between these two strangers. As they neared the end of Robert's list, he began humming again. This time, a gentle Mozart piece. "This one always makes me think of Sunday mornings," he explained. "My wife and I would listen to classical music while making breakfast together." His voice carried no sadness, only grateful remembrance. Neither of them realized they were being watched by other customers, some taking pictures with their phones, touched by the simple beauty of their interaction. In a world often criticized for its disconnection and hurry, this moment of genuine human connection stood out like a beacon of hope. They were about to head to the checkout counter, unaware that their simple morning of grocery shopping was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would remind their entire community of the power of small acts of kindness. At the checkout counter, the morning light streamed through the store's front windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. The friendly cashier, wearing a name tag that read "Miss Betty," greeted them with a warm smile. She had watched their journey through the store and was touched by their unexpected friendship. "Good morning, Professor," Miss Betty called out, having known Robert from his regular visits before his eyesight failed. "I see you've met our favorite Sunday morning shopper." She began scanning their items, carefully keeping Robert's groceries separate from Michelle's. The total for Robert's groceries slowly climbed on the display: $45.67, $89.23, $132.45. Michelle noticed Robert's hand moving toward his wallet, his fingers searching for his credit card with practiced movements. The card, when he finally pulled it out, was worn around the edges from years of use. "That'll be $178.45, Ms. Betty announced gently. Robert ran his fingers over his credit card one more time, a gesture that seemed almost like a prayer, before handing it to the cashier. Michelle watched as Ms. Betty swiped the card once, twice, then a third time. Each attempt was met with a declining beep that seemed to grow louder in the quiet morning store. "I'm so sorry, Professor," Ms. Betty said softly, "but your card isn't going through." The color drained from Robert's face, and his hands began to tremble slightly. "Perhaps there's been some mistake with the bank," he murmured, reaching for his phone. "My son usually handles these things, but with the weekend." Michelle could see the embarrassment creeping across Robert's features, the same proud face that had lit up while talking about music now clouded with distress. Other customers began to line up behind them, and though they tried to be discreet, their impatient shuffling was impossible to ignore. Without hesitation, Michelle stepped forward. "Please, let me take care of this," she said quietly, pulling out her own card. Robert began to protest, his voice catching slightly. "Oh no, my dear, I couldn't possibly." But Michelle had already handed her card to Ms. Betty. "Consider it an investment in music education," Michelle said warmly, thinking of her students. "After all, I'm hoping you might share some of those teaching techniques you mentioned." Her voice was light, careful to preserve his dignity while making it impossible to refuse her help. Ms. Betty, understanding the delicate moment, quickly processed the payment. Through the soft beeping of the register, Robert stood quietly, his white cane tapping gently against the floor. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Michelle assured him, carefully placing his grocery bags in his cart. "Sometimes we all need a little help. Besides, my grandmother would never forgive me if I didn't help someone in need." She described where each bag was placed, creating a mental map he could use to find his items later. Unknown to both of them, a young woman in line had been recording their interaction on her phone. Moved by the scene unfolding before her, she would later post it on the local community Facebook page. But for now, she simply watched, her own groceries forgotten, as humanity played out its best scene. Robert reached out and found Michelle's hand, squeezing it gently. "Your students are very lucky to have you," he said softly. "As am I today." His words carried the weight of sincere gratitude, unmarred by shame or embarrassment. A young boy in the next line tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking loudly why the lady was helping the old man. His mother's response carried clearly across the checkout area. "Because that's what good people do, honey. They help others without expecting anything in return." As they prepared to leave the store together, neither Michelle nor Robert could have guessed how their simple interaction would soon touch hearts across their community. The recipe for change, it seemed, sometimes started with nothing more than a declined credit card and an open heart. Ms. Betty watched them go, shaking her head slightly with a smile. In her 30 years behind this register, she'd seen countless transactions, but few had touched her heart quite like this one. Sometimes, she thought, the most valuable things couldn't be paid for with any credit card. The video of Michelle and Robert's grocery store encounter spread through the local community Facebook page like wildfire. The young woman who recorded it had added a simple caption. "This is what real kindness looks like. Happened this morning at Fresh Value Grocery. Made me cry happy tears. Hashtag community love." By Sunday evening, the post had already gathered hundreds of shares. Comments poured in from community members, each adding their own perspective to the touching story. "That's Ms. Michelle from Pine Elementary." One parent wrote, "She taught both my kids. Such a beautiful soul." Another commented, "Professor Robert taught my daughter violin 15 years ago. He's a local treasure." The store manager, who had been off that Sunday, watched the video during his Monday morning coffee. He immediately recognized both Michelle and Robert, remembering how the professor used to buy flowers every Friday for his wife. Moved by what he saw, he shared the video on the store's official page, adding his own message about community spirit. Local news stations began reaching out through social media, trying to identify the kind-hearted teacher who had helped the elderly professor. But Michelle, busy with her Monday morning class, remained blissfully unaware of her growing internet fame. She was focused on helping her students understand fractions through musical notes inspired by her conversation with Robert. You see, she explained to her class, drawing quarter notes and eighth notes on the board. Music is just math with a melody. Her students watched in fascination as she demonstrated how 4 quarter notes filled a measure, just like 4 quarters made a whole. She thought of Robert and smiled, grateful for the unexpected inspiration he provided. Meanwhile, across town, Robert's phone kept ringing with calls from old students and colleagues who had seen the video. His son in Nashville finally called, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about the credit card? I could have fixed it right away." Robert simply chuckled. Sometimes our mistakes lead us to exactly where we need to be. The local coffee shop owner, whose daughter was in Michelle's class, recognized her regular customer in the video. She printed out some of the kindest comments and stuck them on her community bulletin board. "Real heroes wear yellow cardigans," read one post, referencing Michelle's bright sweater. "This is the Memphis we love," declared another. By Monday afternoon, the video had caught the attention of the local TV news station. The reporter, touched by the story's authenticity, decided to dig deeper. She discovered that Michelle not only taught full-time, but also cared for her mother, who was recovering from surgery. She learned about Robert's 40 years of teaching music and his struggle to maintain independence after losing his sight. The story resonated particularly strongly in their small community, where people still remembered a time when neighbors looked out for each other without hesitation. In a world often divided by differences, this simple act of kindness between two people from different backgrounds touched something universal in everyone who watched. Comments continued to flood in. "Made me remember my grandmother today. We need more people like this in our world. This is the America I believe in." Each message reflected not just approval of a kind act, but hope for a more compassionate community. Local businesses began responding too. The music store owner, who had supplied instruments to Robert's students for decades, started planning something special. The community center director watched the video 3 times, each time seeing new possibilities for bringing people together. None of this social media storm had reached Michelle yet. She was busy after school, helping a student master a particularly challenging math problem. Just like Professor Roberts said, she explained patiently, sometimes we just need to look at things from a different angle. The video's impact continued to grow, touching hearts and inspiring actions across the community. But its real magic lay in its simplicity: 2 people, a grocery store, and a moment of genuine human connection. Without realizing it, Michelle and Robert had reminded their community that the greatest stories aren't scripted. They're written in small acts of kindness. As the sun set on that Monday evening, neither of them knew that their simple grocery store encounter was about to bring about changes that would impact not just their lives, but their entire community in ways they never could have imagined. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Pine Elementary School office. A well-dressed businessman in his 40s stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the cheerful bulletin boards covered with student artwork. This was Tom, Robert's son, who had made the 3-hour drive from Nashville as soon as he saw the viral video of his father's grocery store encounter. "I'm looking for Michelle," he explained to the school secretary, his voice carrying traces of emotion. "She helped my father at the grocery store on Sunday." The secretary smiled knowingly. By now, everyone at the school had seen the video. She called down to Michelle's classroom, where students were busy creating their own musical instruments from recycled materials. When Michelle arrived at the office, her yellow cardigan now spotted with glue and glitter from her students' projects, she found not just Tom, but also a local news crew waiting. Her first instinct was to step back, uncomfortable with the attention, but Tom's earnest expression made her pause. "My father hasn't stopped talking about you," he began, his voice catching slightly. "He called me Sunday evening and spent an hour describing how you made him feel human again." Tom pulled out his phone, showing Michelle the hundreds of comments and shares their story had received. "But that's not why I'm here." As Tom spoke, Michelle learned the full story. Robert's credit card had been frozen due to suspicious activity, something Tom usually handled but had missed during a busy work week. "Dad's too proud to ask for help," he explained. "He's been struggling with losing his independence, but he won't move to Nashville near me. Says his whole life is here in Memphis." The news crew filmed quietly as Tom shared how seeing the video had opened his eyes. "I've been so focused on Dad's physical safety that I forgot about his need for connection, for community." He described how Robert had been withdrawing from social activities since losing his sight, how his world had been slowly shrinking. Michelle listened, thinking about her own mother's struggles with independence during her recovery. "Sometimes," she offered gently, "the hardest thing isn't losing abilities. It's losing the confidence to try." She told Tom about Robert's face lighting up when he talked about teaching music, about how clearly his passion still shone through. Then Tom revealed something that made Michelle's heart skip. Robert had started playing his violin again. "For the first time since Mom passed," he said, wiping his eyes quickly. "He called me last night to say he's been thinking about teaching again, maybe in a different way." Said something about fourth graders and fractions. The school principal, who had been listening from her office, stepped out with an idea forming. The school had been looking for ways to enrich their music program, and here was a former professor with decades of experience, living right in their community. "Maybe," she suggested, "we could turn this into something more permanent." As they talked, more pieces fell into place. The local news reporter, caught up in the moment, began jotting down notes about community programs, intergenerational learning, and the power of music to bring people together. This wasn't just a heartwarming story anymore, it was becoming something bigger. Tom pulled out an envelope from his briefcase. "Before I get ahead of myself, there's something else." Inside was a check, a gesture of gratitude not just for the groceries, but for giving his father back his sense of purpose. Michelle tried to refuse, but Tom was insistent. "Please," he said, "let us help you like you helped my father." The amount on the check made Michelle's eyes widen. $5,000. Tom had discovered through the community grapevine about her mother's medical bills. "Sometimes," he said, echoing her own words from Sunday, "we all need a little help." The school hallway filled with the sound of children singing from a nearby classroom, providing a perfect backdrop to this moment. Michelle stood there, the check in her hand, thinking about how a simple decision to help someone had rippled out in ways she never could have imagined. What started as a chance encounter in a grocery store was transforming into something that would touch countless lives in their community. And this was just the beginning. 1 week after the grocery store encounter, Michelle stood nervously on Robert's front porch. The invitation for afternoon tea had arrived through Tom, who insisted his father was eager to thank her properly. The modest brick house was well maintained, with cheerful flower beds that Robert's wife had planted years ago. Before Michelle could ring the doorbell, she heard music floating through the window, the sweet, clear notes of a violin playing Bach. She stood quietly, listening to the melody that spoke of both joy and longing. The music stopped, and Robert's voice called out, "Is that you, Michelle? Please come in." Opening the door, Michelle was surprised to find not just Robert, but a small gathering of people in his living room. Tom was there, along with the school principal, the local news crew, and several community members she recognized from the grocery store. The room was filled with the scent of fresh-baked cookies and afternoon tea. "I hope you don't mind a little surprise," Robert said, carefully placing his violin in its case. "It seems their grocery store adventure has sparked quite a movement in our community." The walls of his living room were lined with photographs, years of students, concert performances, and family moments frozen in time. The school principal stepped forward, holding a folder. "We've been talking," she began, "about starting a special music program at Pine Elementary. Professor Robert has agreed to come twice a week to teach our students about classical music and its connection to mathematics." Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she continued, "And we've already received donations for instruments from the local music store." Robert beamed, standing a little straighter. "Michelle helped me realize that losing my sight doesn't mean I've lost my ability to teach," he explained. "Music lives in the ears and the heart, not the eyes." He reached for his violin again, demonstrating how he could still perfect each note by feel and sound alone. The local news reporter, who had been quietly filming, asked Michelle about her reaction. She looked around the room at the faces of people who had come together because of one simple moment of kindness. "I just did what anyone should do," she said softly. "I never imagined it would lead to all this." Tom cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "That's not all," he said, nodding to someone in the corner. A representative from the local medical center stepped forward with another envelope. "After hearing about your mother's medical bills, our hospital board met. We'd like to offer assistance through our community care program." Michelle's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter explaining that 75% of her mother's remaining medical bills would be covered by the hospital's charitable foundation. "We believe in paying kindness forward," the hospital representative explained. "Your story reminded us why this program exists." The grocery store manager, who had slipped in quietly, announced that they would be starting a new program. "We're setting up weekly assisted shopping hours," he explained. "Trained volunteers will help elderly and disabled customers with their shopping, inspired by what you two showed us was possible." Tears welled in Michelle's eyes as Robert began to play his violin again, this time a joyful piece that seemed to dance through the room. Her students would hear this music soon, would learn from this remarkable man who had found a new way to share his gift. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its golden light. Someone passed around cookies that Robert had baked using his wife's recipe, proving that some skills never fade. The room filled with conversation and laughter, the sound of community being rebuilt one connection at a time. A small girl, the daughter of one of the community members, asked Robert if she could touch his violin. With infinite patience, he showed her how to hold the bow, explaining how the music lived in the space between the notes. Michelle watched, thinking about how many more children would soon have this same opportunity. What had started as a simple act of kindness in a grocery store had blossomed into something beautiful. A reminder that community isn't just a place, but a choice we make every day to see and help each other. And this was only the beginning of their story. 3 months later, the Pine Elementary School auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents, teachers, and community members filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the makeshift stage where 34th graders stood holding various musical instruments. At the center stood Robert, his violin tucked under his chin, and beside him, Michelle beamed with pride at her students. "Welcome to our first Mathematics in Music showcase," the principal announced to enthusiastic applause. The program that had started with a chance encounter in a grocery store had blossomed into something extraordinary. Twice a week, Robert had been visiting the school, teaching children about the magical connection between music and math. The children began to play, led by Robert's violin. Though not every note was perfect, the joy on their faces was unmistakable. In the front row, Michelle's mother sat in her wheelchair, now fully recovered from her surgery, wiping happy tears as she watched her daughter guide a young boy's hands on the piano keys. "Music is fractions you can hear," Robert always told the students. Under his guidance, they had learned to count beats, understand rhythm, and see mathematics in a whole new way. Test scores had improved, but more importantly, the children had gained confidence and creativity. The grocery store's assisted shopping program had taken off beautifully. Every Wednesday morning, volunteers helped elderly and disabled customers with their shopping. Ms. Betty, The cashier who had witnessed the original encounter now coordinated the program, matching volunteers with those who needed assistance. The local news crew had returned to film this concert, but this time they weren't just capturing a single act of kindness. They were documenting a community transformation. The reporter smiled as she interviewed a small boy who proudly explained how quarter notes and eighth notes helped him understand fractions. Tom sat next to his father, watching as Robert conducted the children's orchestra with the same passion he had shown during his university days. He no longer worried about his father living alone. The community had become an extended family. Robert now had dinner invitations for every night of the week, though he still insisted on cooking his famous peach cobbler himself. During intermission, Michelle shared how the program had spread to other schools in the district. "We're not just teaching music," she explained to the gathered parents. "We're teaching children that everyone has something valuable to contribute, regardless of age or ability." The medical center's community care program had expanded too, inspired by the ripple effects of kindness they had witnessed. More families were getting the help they needed, and the hospital had started a volunteer program connecting elderly patients with community visitors. Robert's violin students from years past had begun stopping by his house, bringing their own students for master classes. His living room, once quiet and lonely, now regularly filled with music and laughter. He had found a new purpose, teaching children to hear the mathematics in Mozart and the patterns in Bach. The second half of the concert began with a surprise. The children performed a piece they had composed themselves, dedicated to the grocery store angels, their nickname for Michelle and Robert. The melody wove together themes of kindness, connection, and community, played on instruments donated by local music stores and community members. As the final notes faded away, Robert stood before the audience, his violin at his side. "3 months ago," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I thought I had lost my way. But sometimes, when we think we're lost, we're actually just finding a new path." He turned toward where he knew Michelle stood with her students. "Sometimes, that path starts in a grocery store." The applause that followed wasn't just for the music. It was for the reminder that small acts of kindness can transform entire communities. What had begun with fallen cans and a declined credit card had grown into a movement of compassion and connection. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Michelle looked around at the faces she now knew so well. The grocery store staff, the hospital workers, the parents, and most importantly, the children who had learned that music, math, and kindness all spoke the same language. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was a new beginning, a story that would continue to unfold in unexpected ways, touching more lives and inspiring more acts of kindness in their community and beyond.